Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Scrutiny and Policy Overview Committee. I'm Councillor Jameson, I'm the chairman of this committee, and members and officers have their names in front of them for ease of reference. May I just ask, in order to assist the process, that members of the gallery turn off their phones or put them on silent, which would enable the meeting to run more smoothly. I'd like to remind everybody present that this meeting will be filmed by the Council and broadcast live on the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. Okay. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence.
Apologies received, Chairman, from Councillor Abbott, Councillor Grace and Councillor Smith.
Thank you. I don't suppose we have a reason for their apologies, do we?
I understand Councillor Abbott is away, but I'm not sure of the other reasons, Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure Councillor Abbott will be with us in spirit, but it's a long way from Lincoln.
Okay, thank you. Declarations of interest. Item 3, Christchurch Local Plan Review, Options Consultation. May I ask Mr. Truitt to come and join us at the table? And we have two other councillors with us this evening, Councillor Mrs. Jameson. Would you like to come and join us at the table, just in case you have any questions? You'll probably be more comfortable sat up here. Okay, Simon.
Well, Chairman, the report you have before you is in part the report that you considered at your previous meeting, supplemented with additional paragraphs which are the same as the Community Committee considered at its meeting on the 20th of July to the 20th of, I'll get my own dates confused, 20th of June to consider the options document for consultation. So on that basis, Chairman, I'm not proposing to do an introduction to the report and happy to answer questions.
Okay, so would you mind then if I asked a question? I've got a question which is I think is quite important, and it's to do with employment. It's to do with employment and housing, and how we tie the two in together, because it is a point that you raise, responding effectively for economic growth, and I think it ties in also with the infrastructure, because if you put in too many houses and you don't have any employment, then people have got to get in their cars because we don't have any buses in order to get to work, and then they're all competing for the same piece of tarmac at the same time as everybody's trying to get their children to school across the dual carriageway, because there isn't sufficient schooling available on the other side of the dual carriageway. So could you just sort of talk us through that, please?
Well, there's a number of points sort of rolled into one there. I'll start with the link between housing and employment. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that unfortunately that link is probably more vague at the moment than it has been in the past, because the government's advice in terms of under the previous system of carrying out housing market assessments was that economic forecasts should be taken into consideration when preparing a housing market assessment. And the housing market assessment that is currently commissioned, which is still ongoing, effectively followed that methodology. So in other words, it made the link between the economic growth forecast for an area. It's almost the converse of what you've just said, which is actually saying how much economic growth generates how much housing for a workforce to occupy that. And that's aside from, obviously, as you said, the locations for that employment relative to the housing. I mean, unfortunately, I think that link has been somewhat broken because the government then moved to its own national standard methodology for housing requirements, which is what we're using for this plan. But unfortunately, that doesn't factor in employment growth, so it takes no account of employment growth. It's based on household forecasts and affordability of an area. All it says is that if your economic growth indicates that you should be providing even more housing, then you should do that. At the moment, we don't know what's in the SHMA work to know whether even higher housing would be required to meet economic growth. But as you'll appreciate from the picture in this plan, we're struggling to deliver the housing even based on the government's national methodology, never mind going beyond it. So I think the answer to the first part of your question is a bit of an unfortunate one, which is I think the link is slightly broken at the moment between how we calculate housing requirements and how we calculate economic growth and jobs. Turning to the second issue, I mean, I think we're never going to completely be able to knit employment opportunities located exactly beside new housing opportunities. Although I think in a lot of Christchurch there's sufficient sustainable transport links, including bus links, which makes sustainable journeys not involving the car practical, albeit that particularly in the Burton area we've seen bus services cut and minimised, not running at times when it's convenient. I think our hope is that concentrating additional housing growth in larger, more well-planned developments as opposed to the small, what we would call windfall infill development here, there and everywhere, which really doesn't usually contribute very much to infrastructure provision, is that there will be opportunities with larger scale housing in one location to actually start delivering, if not brand new infrastructure, at least helping to sustain the infrastructure or increase the infrastructure that already exists. And certainly in terms of discussions, for example, we've had on, let's say, education, then there would be opportunities for development to see some schools expanded where they can expand, or additional school places funded by new developments.
Thank you for that response. Can I just follow up with the bus links and the jobs, because it's my experience that is not the case, that there is adequate bus provision. My experience is that there is inadequate provision at the time that it is needed to support people going to work, because certainly the Dorset County Council view is that they provide buses for children to go to school, but not buses for people to go to work. And they've actually withdrawn a lot of those services. So now you're left with the bus companies complaining that they can't get to where they want to go to because there are too many cars on the road, because the cars are on the road because they've taken away the bus service. And whilst you may have a issue on a development being able to support the provision of bus services, that's not sustainable in my view, because it's run by private companies, and private companies are looking to make a profit on every route and on every service on every route. So if it doesn't wash its face, then they cut it. And I think that is rather a strange view for them to take, but they take it because they assume that if we want it, we will pay them, and not market themselves for a service which they are providing to the community. So I would take issue at on that particular point, and it's also, I think, in Walkford where you have the same issue, Highcliffe where you have the same issue, Burton where you have the same issue. So that infrastructure thing and employment being closer to a place of residence is more important and not less important. And if you look at, for example, the old Plessy site, which is now Selex, the number of people who lived there and bought properties in that area just for that reason, because they were working there and they could walk around the corner and go to work. And that to me is a very sensible thing to be able to do. So I do think that is an issue that we need to be cognizant of. Does anybody else have any questions, Paul?
Thank you, Chairman. Again, leading on from talk about the infrastructure, so there's a specific methodology appears with the SANG requirement for that. Is there not similar for like medical centres and schools, etc.?
I think our understanding, and we've had, during the consultation period, we've now completed initial meetings with Transport Authority, Education and Health. If I turn to Education and Health, health is probably, I would say, the simplest, but as you'll appreciate, none of these things are simple. And of course, I think the one point to make, Chairman, is that as a planning authority, we're often, if you like, piggy in the middle in this situation, because whilst our job is clearly to try to match additional infrastructure to additional development, we're not always ultimately responsible for whether that infrastructure is delivered on the ground and how acceptable it is. And if I give you an example, just to come back to the point you've made, the clinical commissioning group use a rule of thumb that approximately 2,000 head of population equals 1 GP consulting room. And I mean, they've been at pains to point out that, you know, people's expectation of, let's say, a few hundred houses going in and delivering a new doctor's surgery is, well, for want of a better word, pie in the sky, certainly in the current climate. They are quite happy to suggest that, you know, additional consulting room could be funded in an existing surgery, but that often falls short of public expectations. And of course it masks the fact that the biggest issue for the clinical commissioning group isn't buildings and physical infrastructure, it's recruiting GPs. And there's absolutely no control that, well, certainly myself as a planner and we as a planning authority can have over GP recruitment. So, you know, we can get a developer to provide and fund an extra consulting room in a surgery, and more often than not they would be happy to do it. If that consulting room can't be filled and the wait for a GP appointment stays at 4 or 5 weeks, well, often it's seen, oh, that's the fault of the housing development. But, you know, there are other issues. Education is very complicated. There are some, the financial calculations are straightforward because they're based on Department for Education requirements, which effectively space per child. And developers can, you know, the Education Authority will be able to tell you what a financial requirement for a development will be, based again on the population of school age children in that development. But the complexities, and I'm sure Councillors Jameson and Jones will know this well, because I've certainly been at meetings between them and the Education Authority and debating this point, is the complex issue of parental preference for schools. Filling up schools which are perceived as less popular schools first, rather than providing new schools as part of a development. Again, that is Education Authority policy, it's not planning policy. So, for example, an increase of development in Burton, let's say, which is one of our largest areas, the Education Authority approach to that would be Somerford Primary and the Grange are undersubscribed schools, and therefore the children, school-age children from that development, would be directed to under subscribed schools. Now, whether the parents think that is the right approach, I suspect may vary. And there are all sorts of things that can be done, and the Education Authority do. For example, intake of pupils from Bournemouth and from Hampshire for Christchurch schools can be turned off. So again, the developer, I don't think it's fair actually to say that as a public perception that developers get away scot-free with not providing infrastructure. I think the issue is ultimately the developer hands over the contribution, whether it's physical or financial, and it's what happens to that in the process after that. A, how quickly it takes for the infrastructure to be delivered, and B, actually whether it's in the right place at the right time is the bigger issue. And the frustration for us as both officers and I'm sure members is that that's often outside our control. So, you're correct that actually for a number of, transport is not as easy to say, but for health and education, there are certainly rules of thumb which can be applied.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be coming in on quite a few points, but first, can I congratulate the officers on the new self-destruct documents, which seem to be quite literally. Yeah, thank you. I think this goes right back to 1023 on page 4, which is right at the beginning. The infrastructure required to deliver the plan and timescales and so on, and they will be published at the pre-submission stage. But this, to my mind, is a major weakness of this plan. It's a very interesting document, and obviously there's a great deal of work gone into it. But part of the problem is, as you say, you as planners can't, there's things that are outside even your influence. But there are things that do concern me in particular. One, I think, falls into the political sideline. Here's the government saying you must have more houses. Fine. But as long ago as 2006, when we were in this room debating the regional spatial strategy, we said that council believes we can't accommodate more houses unless we have the infrastructure. And that's what, 12 years ago? And there's been no significant increase in infrastructure. And I do not count bus lanes, bus improvements, junction improvements, cycling improvements as infrastructure, because they do not get to what people want to be able to do is get themselves, whatever the weather, from home to work. And yes, that is simplified if the housing is close to the work so that you can work there. But what happens if you have 2 people in the family, or sometimes 3, and we say we want to encourage mobility of labour, and as industry gets more technical, and we're saying we want high value jobs, but the high value job for one resident might be just across the road, and the job for the other one might be 20 miles away. And then what happens if technological change increases and suddenly they don't want them? They can do it. So we're looking at this, and it must be extremely difficult. I'll take the points that we're on at the minute, and I'll come back later on some of the others, if I may.
Before you do, I've got Fred who wants to talk about something.
I was going to come in on education, if I may.
Okay.
Specifically.
And then you want to...
Yeah. You see, we have a problem. For the whole time that I've been on the county council, which is 10 years, the county councillors have been bashing at the education officers to say you must provide new schools. And they've come back to us and said, but the borough doesn't want new schools. The borough officers don't want them. We said, but yes, you do. And they've had to accept one, which we've got at in Fairmount. And we were here, it was in this building when we actually found a possible site for that. But we have said, you have here a development of near enough 1,000 houses. That's going to be what, 2,500 people? You need a school because Highcliffe is growing, Holborn's growing. So we should have said, as we're developing this, the school, we want a space for school, but because there's a mismatch here somewhere, because at one point, as I understand it, and Councillor Jones will correct me if I'm wrong, the borough was saying you need a school, and the Education Authority was saying no, we don't. And then after we convinced the Education Authority that yes, we were right because we've shown them on the figures that we predicted that they have gone up, and the figures that they predicted are totally wrong. Yes, we need a new school, but then they turn around and say, well, the borough won't put one in the plan. So you won't identify the space for a school. So somewhere along the line, there is a problem. And this ties in with other things. We've got the aspiration for a bypass, and that's not your problem. But there are other things that we can look at. So yes, you are dealing with a very difficult situation. But it seems to me that a lot of what is predicted here, and I'm glad Fred is coming on to transport, so I'll let you have first go. Because that's another point.
Councillor Neal. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Chairman. What the officer said in his opening up remarks was that there was good bus links, but there isn't. Could you tell me what bus runs to the airport, which is our largest employment area, from Christchurch? Because there isn't one, is there? I mean, that's quite a large area where we're not actually covering the transport. But if you try and get up Fairmile Road and Home Road and that, it is absolute gridlock for best part of the day, not just the rush hour. So I take challenge on the infrastructure with buses going to the right places for the work. It is where we've developed a lot of commercial properties, and it is our only large area to put employment land. The other thing that was mentioned was that GP surgeries, you said, well, if people put a few hundred houses on, they expect a new GP surgery, but that 900 odd houses is going to be, I said 2,200, working at 2.4 because of families, the average family 2.4. So that's a good 400 children. There's no, in that 900, there's no doctor's surgery, or there's no element for a school. 400 might not be a whole school, but it's a good half a school.
I think the number was approximately 2,000 people equals one GP. Yeah. That's not to do with the infrastructure of the surgery. It's just to do with the number of doctors. But a house, if you have an estate, I'm assuming that there must be a ratio of number of houses to number of people, not just 2 people per house, but it needs to include.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the 2.4 figure that Councillor Neal mentioned, that's the standard figure for occupancy. There are figures that, for example, education use for a number of children of different ages, and I don't have those figures. I mean, they're a bit of a dark art for the education providers, but I mean, they work on their own figures for those. I mean, just to make the point, Chairman, I mean, I don't disagree with Councillor Neal. What I actually said was that there are parts of Christchurch which are very well served by buses, and clearly parts that are not. And the airport is one. I mean, the airport bus link, such as it is a bus link to Bournemouth, not to Christchurch. So, I mean, I fully recognise that there are parts of the borough which are not well served.
Have you finished?
I'll finish it.
Okay. Just as an infrastructure point on transport and public service, the other area where I believe it falls down is at the railway station, because it's not integrated at all. And if people are going or coming into Christchurch by train, they've got to walk down to Christchurch before they can get on a bus. So I just wonder how we are going to accommodate that in the local plan.
Well, I'm not sure they have to walk to Christchurch. There are high frequency buses in Stour Road at the adjacent to the main entrance of the station. The other entrance, it's a little bit further to walk to a bus. We've got no proposals at this stage to increase bus access to the station, mainly because I think it's largely physically very difficult. It would require, I mean, the entrance to the station I think you could probably just about get a bus into it, but there's no adequate bus turning area or interchange. So I mean, it isn't something that forms part of the plan at the moment. We will be consulting. We have a specific consultation meeting coming up with the two main bus operators in the area. Well, the three if you include East Dorset, but Yellow Buses and More Bus for Christchurch. Coming up in September. We're trying to set one up with South Western Railway, without success at the moment, I have to say, but and to try to see what their views are. They're quite hard people to pin down, generally speaking. So we'll raise that point. The last time it was raised, I think further bus access to the station. I think the view was that you have a high frequency bus at the station entrance, and that's as far as it'll go. Could I just come back on one point that Councillor Jones made? Was just about the stage of the plan and the difficulties between the consultation on housing and then the lack of detail and infrastructure. I mean, I think it's a fair point, and it's quite clearly been raised a lot by people who've responded to the consultation. But I think the point to stress is here that, and I think I made this point at the Scrutiny meeting when I last attended, that the planning regulations as they're drafted at the moment are not particularly helpful, because the next consultation stage is effectively our last word. In fact, one or two of my colleagues prefer not to even call it a consultation, because effectively what you're doing is saying, here's our final plan, and if you make any comments on it, we'll just send them to the planning inspector and he or she can deal with it. I think we feel that with housing being such a contentious issue here, we need to do some form of consultation which enables us to gain public views on, I mean, they may not like the housing, but what is useful is for actually people to spell out what the infrastructure concerns are. And it often is more about infrastructure than actually we don't want the houses. I think if people feel that the infrastructure can be developed and sustained in their area, they will accept the houses. They see the argument for them. So I do agree with Councillor Jones that the downside of this sort of consultation is that people say, well, you're telling me one half of the story and you're not telling me the other. However, the benefit from it is that we can start to tie in the comments that we're receiving with the meetings that we're having with the infrastructure providers to say, these are the issues coming out of this consultation. If we're delivering houses here, how do we make it happen? And that's what we're trying to do, a sort of twin track approach before we get to the stage of actually saying to people, the houses are going to be on this site, and here's the infrastructure requirements, because by then, if somebody comments and says they don't like them, there's nothing we can do to respond to that. So, I accept Councillor Jones' point. It's a perfectly valid point, but I just wanted to reinforce that that's why we're doing an additional consultation.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
A lot of work on this, and you're very brave coming without any colleagues to support you, so all the flack you get, and hopefully you might get some praise along the way. But on this question of infrastructure and new houses, obviously one that isn't just aspirational is the Rochot Hill development. And I was on the planning committee where a majority of members decided to give consent, despite a lot of concern, to the outline planning permission. Now, one of those things was that one of the great bases of that Rochot development was that the power lines were going to be buried, and it says so in this. Now, at that meeting, the man from South West Electricity said categorically no agreement has been reached. We were told to ignore that comment, but the housing developer was quite convinced that they would be buried. Now, obviously, there is an inconsistency there, but have we got any further information on whether these power lines which were regarded as vital to the development of that site, are they going to be developed? Are they going to be buried?
Unfortunately, Chairman, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I can ask Linda King, who's the Development Management Manager, to provide you with an update, but I don't have one, I'm afraid.
I think I can give you some information on that. It's my understanding that they are going to be buried.
Definitely.
Yes. Well, it's my understanding. I'll give you an 80%,
Thank you.
if that's okay.
Well, that's a great reassurance. Thank you.
Okay.
But could I also say on this question of transport, much was made of the use of Hinton Admiral Station for that development. Now, that's not even in our borough, and it has a short platform which large trains, long trains, can't access. So surely to goodness, we've got to have some form of face-to-face agreement with the authorities before we can say, oh, people will happily walk up there to get a train when most of the trains don't stop there. And if they wanted to, they can't.
I'm not sure whether I can really give you an answer to that question. I mean, again, it's about the strategy for that development is to make Hinton Admiral Station more accessible. And I mean, at the moment, I don't think anybody would brave walking up the A35 to get from Rowshot to Hinton Admiral Station. They'd be lucky to be alive when they got there. So, I mean, in terms of the development, it's about making access to the station easier for people who would occupy those houses in future. I mean, it comes back to my point to Councillor Hilliard that we're ultimately not always responsible for the services that are provided by the infrastructure providers. I mean, one would hope that South Western Railway or Network Rail would see the development of close to 1,000 houses close to one of their quieter stations as a good thing, and maybe encourage them that more trains would stop at Hinton Admiral. Again, at the moment, that's outside our control. All we can do is encourage people to use that station. I mean, it is the closest. Christchurch obviously offers a better service, but Hinton Admiral is a much closer station to that development.
I understand. Can I just come in there? I understand that part of that development would be a roundabout on the A35 to break up the flow of the traffic. Also, that the access road is in New Forest District Council area. And it brings me on to a point that I was going to raise somewhere else, is the duty to cooperate. And we have a duty to cooperate not only with the people to our west, but also the people to our east. And I understand that within that duty to cooperate is a greenbelt issue. And I also understand that within that greenbelt issue, there is a cooperation between the authorities to see which is the best way to deal with a particular issue. And this one that you've just raised, Councillor Mrs. Jones, is a particular one which I've been going on about for a number of years, is the access to Hinton Admiral Station from the A35. And there is no sidewalk, no pavement there at all. And I've been trying to persuade Hampshire County Council that they ought to spend some of their surpluses on that, and it hasn't been particularly well received. But perhaps with the could you talk about the duty to cooperate on Greenbelt and perhaps how that ties in with the subsequent discussions as to which is the best way to do that?
Well, in terms of the duty to cooperate generally, in terms of this plan, as the report sets out, in the case of the Christchurch local plan review, even with the additional housing on green and further proposed greenbelt release, or at least housing options on greenbelt land, we're not able to fully meet our housing requirement as per the government's national methodology. And our colleagues in East Dorset, in their version of this local plan review, are in a position to fully meet their housing requirement as set by the government's methodology, but again, that is with greenbelt release around certain settlements. So, as you rightly say, Chairman, that triggers the fact that we're both considering development in the greenbelt triggers the need for us to consult with adjoining authorities to ask them essentially, have they got housing land available that is not within the greenbelt, which could possibly serve the needs of Christchurch or indeed East Dorset, or vice versa. We've sent letters out, formal letters, formal requests. There's obviously a lot of informal work. There's regular liaison meetings between ourselves and our colleagues in New Forest and the National Park, and as members will appreciate, there's more formal arrangements in Dorset through the Strategic Planning Forum, etc. However, we've also sent formal letters to all adjoining authorities making that request. To date, we've received letters back from New Forest District and from Purbeck, and in both cases, they themselves are proposing greenbelt release to meet their housing requirements because they can't meet them in any other way. I have to be honest, Chairman, I'm not expecting a great deal of difference from the remaining letters to Borough of Poole, who have released land from the greenbelt in their current plan, which is about to be adopted, and Bournemouth, although they have no particular progress on a local plan review, have very high housing requirements and clearly limited opportunities to meet those. So the difficulty in this area, Chairman, is that there is no one authority which is in a very advantageous position compared to ourselves. Most of the authorities around us are similarly struggling with high housing requirements, greenbelt, and other significant constraints. I think, Chairman, that's at a slightly different level then to some of the more detailed issues. So, for example, I can't really give you detailed advice on the Roshot application because I haven't been dealing with it firsthand. But there are clearly opportunities for an authority like ours to take a transport contribution from a developer and negotiate that that's spent in an adjoining authority if that provides a clear benefit. For the most part, we would want to spend those contributions in our own area, but in an instance like you've raised, where Hampshire County Council, perhaps as Transport Authority, are saying, well, we don't see the need to fund pavement improvements to Hinton Admiral Station, we could take a financial contribution from a large development and say, well, we'll provide the funding for you to do it. That obviously is not what you would call a true duty to cooperate issue, but it's a practical way in which we can do that. What I'm uncertain about is whether that process is happening with the Roshot application.
I think, Mr. Chairman, most people know that I'm involved with a railway station at Christchurch, and South West Trains were going to integrate a new timetable recently, and that meant not stopping at smaller stations like Admiral Hinton, and also extending their trains to a minimum of 10 to 12 coaches. And 10 to 12 coaches can't stop at Hinton Admiral, so there is a need to actually talk further or wider to other authorities like South West Trains as well as Hampshire County Council.
Could I just ask the officer? There is a committee called, or a forum called Connected Dorset, which I believe we have a seat at the table, which I have been a participant there from Dorset County Council, and that does deal with these particular matters. And what I've found at those meetings is that the railway providers are far more amenable, far more proactive in providing a service than the bus providers, who just want to come along to the council and say, we're short of money, please give us more money if you want us to do this service. But we do have a seat at that table, and I just wondered if that is the forum for some of these discussions going forward for transport hubs and things like that.
I see no reason why not, Chairman. It's not a forum that I attend, so I don't know a lot about it myself. But I mean, to be honest, we're quite happy to take any opportunities. Network Rail themselves undertake an annual stakeholder engagement conference, which I've attended in the last 2 years, and we've made the point about Hinton Admiral to them. Again, there's the difficulty between what they're primarily interested in is access to stations and the physical station infrastructure, but then you still have the points that Councillor Neil's raised about the train operating company and their particular policies about, you know, stopping trains at certain stations, length of trains, etc. So, you know, unfortunately, like a lot of things, railway is not one. It's not seeing one. You don't see one person. So it's about taking every opportunity going to make the same point.
But at the Connected Dorset Forum, they are all sat around the table, all the bus operators and the railway and various other sort of providers. Members, we have two of our other councillors, one of whom has indicated that she would like to speak. Is it your wish that we allow this to happen? Margaret.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow on a little bit from the duty to cooperate issue. Both of us attend the Strategic Planning Forum, where there are representatives from every Dorset council. There have been, and Simon attends that as well. There have been discussions on the housing issues across the county and the duty to cooperate. And it is absolutely clear, as I see it, and I think my colleagues here that attend will agree, that no council in Dorset has any additional land spare to cooperate, although they might like to cooperate with anybody on house building. There isn't any. And some, as you said, are already releasing green belt, as we are, and it's the same everywhere. And it's a very, very difficult issue. So that just brings me on, sorry, I thought I'd just bring that in as for starters, as to really a question about the timetable, which you've got here on paragraph 2.11. It was my understanding, I thought we'd said at the Strategic Planning Forum, that we were going to be submitting the plan to Secretary of State in June, but now it says April, which to me is quite good, April 2019, because I think it's absolutely imperative that we get this in as soon as we can. So I just want to confirm that it is now April and not June, because we need to get it in before we join the unitary authority, in my view, because there are other councils, certainly Bournemouth, as you have already mentioned, a very high housing requirement. And what I wouldn't like to see is that our plan wasn't far enough advanced or not submitted, so that it actually, when we were within the unitary, it could in fact be perhaps withdrawn or unravelled, or things changed in it before it had got to a point. I'd like it to see it at a point a little bit like a point of no return, because it's going to take then, after the unitary is formed, there will be a joint plan for Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch at some point, but it's probably going to take at least 5 years for that to happen. So at least we might get some degree of protection from the plan that we've put in, rather than anything being changed and there being requests, because of the joint housing situation with Bournemouth and Poole, for more of our green belt to be released. So I'd just like to get your comments really on that timetable. That is it going to be submitted in April before we are dissolved as such? And then will that mean that it cannot be withdrawn by others or unravelled? I think that's my question. Thank you.
I think the one thing I would say at the outset, Chairman, is this is a very challenging timetable. I mean, we don't know yet the scale of the responses that we're going to get, but I suspect, I mean, they were coming in at the rate of about 100 a day, although that's both plans, and have been doing for about the last week. So, I mean, I suspect we'll be heading towards well over 1,000 responses to the plan consultations. I suspect the majority of those will be in East Dorset rather than Christchurch, but I'm expecting quite a large response in Christchurch. I think the one other thing which I think is causing us some concern at the moment, and I've mentioned it in the report, which is to do with the review of the South East Dorset transport strategy, the multimodal study, which I think the report refers to late 2018, and we have had another meeting with the transport authorities, who are now saying that procurement of that is still ongoing, and so I'm slightly concerned that is certainly not looking likely to be the end of 2018. It's likely to be well into 2019. Now we have to take a view as to whether there's any plan B, which could involve, for example, commissioning our own transport work, modelling work, although there's costs involved in that. So, I would have to say, Chairman, that whilst I think that remains the official timetable, but it's challenging. And of course, submission to the Secretary of State would have to be by the 1st of April 2019, because any date after that, the new authority would have decision. The second point, that Councillor Phipps has raised, is, of course, it doesn't really matter what stage the plan has reached. I can't speak for the new authority. A plan could be submitted to the Secretary of State but still withdrawn. So, at the end of the day, it will be for the new councils, the two new councils, to decide what they do with respective plans in their areas. And one concern that I have to say I would flag up is obviously that, again, the Christchurch plan is a plan for part of the new Bournemouth Christchurch pool area, but as I've already said, we are struggling to meet the housing requirement. And one issue that is likely to come up is it wise to submit a plan which can't meet its housing requirement for that particular area? Now, obviously, the outcome of the options consultation may be that either additional sites may come forward which might enable us to meet that housing requirement, or we may be in a position of being able to say more firmly that we shouldn't be required to meet the government's housing requirement. But until we know that, that is a particular uncertainty. So that was a bit of a rambling answer to Councillor Phipps, but I think I would have to say there are some considerable uncertainties about the timetable. But we're doing everything we can to try to meet that timetable.
Can I just ask you to clarify the point on the multimodal transport plan? Would that form part of our local plan review? If that's a necessary part of the local plan review?
It is necessary because there's two elements to it. The one that takes the time is updating the whole traffic model for South East Dorset, which I understand is called Saturn for some reason I don't fully understand. And that effectively models, it does what Councillor Jones has said we need to be doing, which is actually finding out the implications of where development is going versus the journeys people are going to make, and then which bits of the network are going to be impacted most. And in Christchurch, I think we can probably name all the bits of the network we know are going to be impacted on. Particularly the A35 and the major junctions and around the airport. So that modelling work, it takes some considerable time. We're talking something like 6 to 8 months for the model to be completed, and after the model is completed, that needs to be turned into a transport strategy.
So who is responsible for delivering that?
Dorset County Council at the moment.
And what leverage do we have to get them to do what they're supposed to be doing?
In terms of procurement, we've made them aware of our local plan timetable and the concerns that we have about any delays to the procurement of the model. The model, as I understand it, will be done by transport consultants. The strategy will be developed by the county or the two unitaries, but we don't. Ultimately, it is not our study. So we're faced with a situation of not being in a position to drive it forward any quicker, other than to lobby that it needs to be done as quickly as possible.
So if we get our bit done, they can't hold us up because they haven't done their bit. That's the point I'm getting to. We can still submit our local plan, but it would not have that or the elements that are dependent upon that in it.
Yeah, I think there's probably two alternatives. One is to do what you've just said, which is to submit our plan with a level of housing that we think will not impact on the transport network. the difficulty obviously with that is we may not have a sufficiently robust evidence base to make that judgment, or alternatively we can commission some form of our own transport strategy. The concerns with that are that obviously again that takes time, particularly if we want modelling work done, and the cost of that as well that we would have to bear, as opposed to spread between either the county council or other transport authorities.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's a bit of a sort of no-win, rock and a hard place sort of situation, isn't it? Anything else, Margaret?
There was one. I don't want to. If anybody
No.
else wants to go, I just had one more.
Go on.
I was just going to ask really about the SANGs. To be honest with you, I was a little surprised when I got this about that they're thinking of designating. It's page 33 of the local plan. Water Meadows as a SANG, the A35 Water Meadows, and also coming back as well to the Stour Valley Park, where that in effect is also designating water meadows in certain places along there. And I'm a little bit concerned about that and wondered why we have to designate water meadows, basically for people, you're actually attracting people to them. That is a concern. And would you like to comment on it?
In terms of the A35 Water Meadows, my understanding is that there have been quite detailed discussions on the potential of some of that land to have increased public access. That's happened with Natural England, who appear to accept that is acceptable on that particular site, and it could, again, sites like this could help deliver heathland mitigation for town centre or town-based sites in Christchurch, who otherwise would be struggling to find land anywhere near them that would be suitable for SANG provision. Stour Valley Park is a completely different scale. It is a concept at the moment. There's certainly no intention in any local plan to what you would call formally designate or allocate a Stour Valley Park, because it's a vast area of potential land encompassing all sorts of sites. That could form part of a network of open spaces, but I think there are potential benefits that there could be development proposals within the Stour Valley Park area that would effectively deliver SANG provision within that area, and there may be other developments which could contribute financially to the cost of laying out certain sites and land within the Stour Valley to increase access in areas. It doesn't mean that the whole Stour Valley will ever be completely public access, and there may well, as Councillor Phipps suggests, there are probably areas within it where you wouldn't want public access.
Does that answer your question?
Turning to page 108, when we're looking at site ecology, etc., we have this contentious issue of the allotment provision at Roshot Hill. Now, it must be 10 years, I would think, since I was in this chamber and we were discussing the allotments at Roshot Hill. We're still discussing, and it's at one point we actually thought there was a designated site that the allotment holders were happy with, but we're now still at this will be relocated to a suitable site. But when are we actually going to say we have found a suitable site? Because the Roshot Hill allotments is quite a considerable area of the housing development site. So if you want that to succeed, you've got to solve the problem of the allotments. But at the moment, you've got a lot of very unhappy allotment holders who don't know where they're supposed to be going. And their site is very well run, very neat, very organised. So where have we got to after all these years' deliberation?
Unfortunately, Chairman, that there is no suitable site as yet been identified. So the planning application that's been before committee for the Roshot site excludes the allotments, and I mean that will remain the case until a suitable site's found.
Mean then that the total number of houses is going to be less? Because that was included in the original 900 and whatever.
Maybe they'll just be smaller.
Well, it does mean that the overall number of houses will be less at the moment. The planning application is for 875, I believe. The core strategy policy was for 950. I mean, if the allotments were fully developed, you would actually end up, I think, in total with well over 950. I think it'd be more something like 1125, I think. So at the moment, there is technically that, you know, we're slightly under the core strategy figure for that site. But as I say, if the allotments, I mean, it's still our intention to see the allotments relocated and the remainder of the Roshot site developed, but unfortunately, it's proving very difficult to find an alternative allotment site.
It involves the question of the gravel, which is mentioned, and then we don't go any further. Now, the gravel is going to make a tremendous difference to this side of Christchurch and will have an impact, I would think, on the rest. We know that traffic can't go into the New Forest because it is a protected area. So it's got to come down the A35. So it seems to me rather inadequate to say, well, there is the gravel extraction and people will be willing still to live here. I'm not sure whether I would want to live next to a gravel pit, but apart from that, there is this impact on the A35 and the other roads that are distributary roads. So have we got any further with this in our thoughts?
Can I just clarify the point on traffic? Lorries are allowed to go east and then north, so they can go towards Lyndhurst if they're going north onto the A31, onto the M27. What they can't do is come south and then go round Lyndhurst and come this way.
But most of the gravel will be run in the...
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the point that, and of course the gravel is needed to build the houses, so it doesn't travel very far.
The only point I'd add to that, Chairman, is just not to forget that this council's objecting to the gravel. The public examination on the minerals plan is, I think, the end of September, and we will be appearing and making the points you've just made. We're continuing to make our point that rail transport of gravel and aggregates from that site should be investigated. The position of Dorset is that they're not agreeing with us. We've got no agreement, but we will be appearing at the examination.
Yes, thank you. Okay. For you, Mr. Chairman, Simon, you brushed over a bit earlier about the green belt and having communicated with some of the adjoining councils by letter or whatever. But if there is a need to release any land from the green belt, will you be looking at the matter jointly in deciding which is the most appropriate sites, or is that going to be just done by your own section?
First and foremost, we still at the moment have to try to meet our own housing needs within our own area. I mean, where opportunities exist to discuss with adjoining authorities, we'll be trying to do that. The most obvious example in this plan is our housing option in Bransgore, which is, as I've said before, it's a little bit of an unusual site. It's not particularly well located. Well, it's not well located, particularly for Christchurch's needs. It's right up in the edge of the borough. It immediately adjoins Bransgore Village. However, we know that New Forest District have been struggling to deliver their housing requirements and have needed Greenbelt release, and they've also proposed site allocations in Bransgore. I have to say that this morning we've received New Forest District Council's responses to both the Christchurch and the East Dorset local plan, and New Forest have formally objected to the Bransgore housing option in our plan. So, that will give you some indication of how easy it is in practice to decide between authorities where the best place for the housing to go is. We'll explore whatever opportunities we can, but ultimately, under the current system, and certainly until local government reorganisation may change things in terms of planning for bigger areas, then our main responsibility is to plan for Christchurch.
Not wishing to, you've been very patient, and thank you for that, under quite a barrage of questions, but not wishing to second guess what comes out of the Burton Parish Council view on the local plan. You are aware that the Parish Council has engaged a planning consultant to assist them with that. But the question which I would like to ask is the number, which I think is an incredibly high number of dwellings in Burton of 568, quite a precise number. I just wonder how that sort of number is derived, and clearly the infrastructure issue is probably more significant in Burton than anywhere else, with taking account of, I think it's probably 25% or more of its existing housing stock. And also, of course, the issue with the strategic gaps and the green belt.
In terms of how the number's derived, it's not as precise as it might appear. It's derived from an assessment that we have made of officers of the sites that have come in within our housing option area. However, with some discounting in terms of coming up with a number as to what we think is realistic in terms of constraints. So to illustrate that, in terms of Burton, the one reason that you get to odd figures such as 568 is because there are some very small sites in Winkton which have been suggested with very small figures on them, single figures of dwellings. There are much larger sites, both south and east of Burton, which have clearly got potential for several hundred dwellings. The total of the sites that have come in Regulation 18 for Burton would be well in excess of 568. However, there's a particular site which is the playing fields to the north of Burton, between Burton and Winkton, which I have to say, Chairman, we've decided to put effectively a zero figure on, because it is, although it's a site shown within the option area, we have concerns that site would effectively, if you developed it, would merge Burton and Winkton together. So in most cases, not all, and certainly in East Dorset there are differences, but in a lot of cases with the option areas in these plan documents, the housing number that we've put within the option area is a lot lower than actually the total of the site if you developed all of the sites within the option area. And again, it comes back to the fact that this does what it says on the tin, which is it's an options consultation. So, we're trying to find out which sites people might prefer, or maybe it's a case of hate less. Are there particular sites that it would be easier to develop, and sites which people feel would have a much greater impact on the village. Just one point to make, Chairman. I think the situation, and I should say I've been in quite regular contact with the Parish Council's planning consultant, who's an ex-local authority planner, very good, and I think has a very good understanding of the local plan process. I think the one point to make, Chairman, about the situation on housing in Burton is we're in a different situation than we were with the core strategy, where the housing allocation in Burton was very much to meet specific local needs in Burton. I think, unfortunately, we're in a situation now where the housing need for Christchurch Borough is such and so challenging that the housing level in Burton is effectively meeting Christchurch's needs, not just Burton's needs. And I think that's a simple point to make. We acknowledge that it's a very large housing allocation for Burton, and it's certainly far in excess of what you would require to meet Burton's specific housing need.
Thank you for that.
Oh, I'm sure won't object to having to wait. It's just one point, Simon. When the local plan, our last local plan, was introduced, there was a lot of debate in the chamber about this question of expansion of Burton, and the fact that it had said that, if I remember rightly, Burton should not be coterminous with the rest of Christchurch, i.e. with Grange, which, as you know, is my ward. Now, it seems to me that there's a prospect of the two becoming merged. Is this true, or have I misunderstood?
I think, Chairman, our hope would be to try to always enable Burton to have its own character. I mean, Burton is a village. I think one of the difficulties that Burton faces is that it is a village within, I mean, not far over a mile from Christchurch town centre, and it's unusual in that respect. I acknowledge, as Councillor Jameson said, there are specific infrastructure issues, particularly transport, that Burton suffers from. Bus services in the centre of Christchurch are very good, and then suddenly in Burton they're not very good at all. But nonetheless, in terms of access to facilities, it's not the same as what you would describe as a rural village, and that creates a problem for us as planners, because it's not necessarily an unsustainable location for new development for Christchurch, setting aside obviously the Greenbelt issue. Because of the proximity to the rest of services and facilities in Christchurch. However, any new development has still got to try to respect the character of Burton, things like the conservation area, the green, and try to retain the village character. I mean, the one thing in terms of separation is the railway line effectively creates a barrier between Christchurch and Burton that will never be overcome. So there will always be a degree of separation. But I acknowledge that this is a difficult balance, because it's not putting 500 or 600 houses in a rural village that is away from other services. But we've still got to try to make sure that you don't drive through Burton and just think you're in any other part of Christchurch.
I think the point is that it's only part of Burton which is within a mile of Christchurch. Most of Burton is 2.5 miles away from Christchurch.
It is. I think, again, it's not a huge distance. I think that's the difficulty.
It is if you have to walk. Did that answer your question? Yes. Councillor Jones, thank you. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. What I'd like to pick up on are basically two of the concepts that drive this plan, or one in particular, and I keep coming across the term climate change. I keep thinking to myself, what climate change? And I keep looking at things that say increasing sea levels. Now, when I came onto the council 20 years ago, I asked one of your predecessors, how much has the mean sea level at Newlyn risen in the past 20 years? And back came the answer, it hasn't. And I checked the other day and it still hasn't risen. So forgive me for taking some of these concerns with a measure of cynicism. I've even heard people saying that, well, this summer that we've just had certainly proves that the climate is changing. But you'll be too young to remember the summer of '76 when we didn't lose a single day's play. I'm trying to flatter you. When we didn't lose a single day's play in any first-class cricket. And that followed on the summer of '75, which was also pretty hot. So forgive me for being a little cynical and thinking that climate change is the biggest scam since Bernie Madoff. No, it predates Bernie Madoff, I apologise. But that does, to pick up on that and lead into, we talk a lot about sustainable development. And that, in some ways, yes, I agree. There's only so much coal, there's only so much raw materials, and we ought to be looking at using what we've got sensibly. But then we come on to looking at the effects of this on transport. And I'm delighted to see outbreaks of what look dangerously like sense. Because we're now looking at putting in electric vehicle charging points. We're looking at, we've said here, which is one of the number of times that both Councillor Jameson and I have sat here on the planning committee, and we've said that the parking provision ideas are possibly not good, and I can congratulate you very thoroughly on putting in parking provision should be appropriate for the type and scale of its development and its location. And this is actually seems to me to be a recognition that if you don't provide enough on-site parking, people will park off-site. And I think we had this in Peppercorn Lane, was it? Which is, and that has floods out into Burton Road. And that is sensible.
That was a long time ago.
It was, but we're seeing the actual results of what we said at the time, and it's now true. But let's think about one or two things. We're saying that we don't want to, that people will travel from Rowshot Hill, says to where they put a new surgery or a new room on a surgery. But that in itself is promoting car journeys. And don't think that people will walk, because you've got a population that basically prefer driving to walking. So when we're talking about how we can minimise traffic growth, I would hope that we see much more about, and I could be wrong and I missed it, enabling home working and recognising that this is something that we should encourage. And I know the council is doing it, and now the county council is doing it, but this should be something that we should be saying, if we can use electronic communications to minimise the need to travel to work. We're accepting that for years the planners have said to me, but you can't go on promoting car journeys because of the nasty pollution. Well, we're now moving into electric cars that don't pollute. And we're still seeing the problem that we're talking about, that we've got to look at more, the impact of carbon emissions and transport will be reduced by more sustainable patterns of development, fine. By encouraging travel by bike, that's fine, but what about people like I'm getting to, where you're getting too old to cycle because your knees aren't going to like going up and down? Where you're getting the areas where people are going to say, I actually want to drive, because we did have a time when buses and railways went everywhere, and then people discovered that the car gave them freedom, and it gave them freedom to move to jobs where they wanted to go, to travel at times when they wanted to go, and not when the planners thought it was a good idea for them to go. And that is something that, we've got to work with what we've got. And at the minute, we've got a central policy that pushes down and says, you've got to look at this and you've got to develop it in this way. But still, there are things that I would have liked to have seen possibly a bit more emphasised. At one point that we mentioned about the airport, there was a railway line once that ran within a mile of the airport. Why aren't we looking at seeing if there's any possibility? If they're talking about reviving the Ringwood line, why can't we look at reviving that line that would take a shuttle service, which should be something that we could be looking at? Why aren't we looking at the Dorset Area Rapid Transport System schemes that have come up? We're looking in many ways, I think. It's like I used to say about the Labour government. Their idea of sustainable transport had 6 wheels and belched diesel fumes. And this is something perhaps that we ought to be looking, maybe if we get we won't ever get the chance, but in the future, maybe it ought to be looked at as a different type of vision. Yes, I'm very happy to say a wider choice of transport. But that doesn't mean to say that you should make transport by car more difficult. If you can make, without making that more difficult, people more able to use genuinely an alternative transport that will do what they want, that's fine. But I see too much in here about traffic management, car park management, junction improvements, and I know very well that what you're looking at is junction improvements that will make life more difficult for motorists, who are the great majority of road users. So on those points, I know there's probably not a lot you can do about it, but you have to work with what we've got. But I think those are my concerns in principle, that we are looking too much at, and I know I'm an old-fashioned reactionary, but I don't accept climate change yet, and I don't accept the greater threat of flooding and so on. But yes, we are living in a time where we ought to be looking at other methods. We ought to be looking at energy conservation and so on, and greater use of renewable energy. And I'm very encouraged to see that for the Roshot Hill, that you might be looking at a combined heat and light scheme, district heating and lighting scheme. And things like that, I think, are very good, but it is a concern. And as I said, if it could be in the future that we're looking at that we maybe look a bit wider, and that we don't try and say to people, we're going to force you out of cars, by one example from a London borough saying we're going to remove all the bus laybys so the buses will move out into the roads and jam the cars up. Harangue over.
You feel better now?
Yeah.
Before we draw this to a close, do you wish? Sorry. Could I just ask Simon, you've been patient, to look at the issues that come forward in your report in para 2.2, the penultimate bullet point. On page 5 of the report to this committee, para 2.2, the penultimate bullet point, which is address the development and community needs of our rural areas. And you've already stated that I think Burton will be supporting Christchurch and no, not the other way around, but bring that forward to objective 5, which I think is slightly contradictory to what you have already stated in its title, to deliver suitable, affordable and sustainable range of housing to provide for local needs. Well, certainly what they have been saying in Burton is happy to take our share of the pain, but the infrastructure is key, and the infrastructure does need to be there first before they could accommodate anything. And that goes with, it's all very well to say, well, we can have buses, but we have got no control over the buses. We need to have better road services and all the rest of the stuff. Yeah. And also bring that into Objective 6, which is on page 24 of the options consultation. In Objective 6, in the first paragraph, congestion will be managed and where possible reduced in key locations by reducing the need to travel. Well, the only way you can reduce the need to travel is to have local employment sites. Local employment sites will mean that people can, where they wish to, cycle to work or walk to work or whatever. And I don't think that is being brought forward. We recognise Bournemouth Airport and the strategic need for Bournemouth Airport and the excellent work that's going on down there. But I do think that we need to accommodate local employment in local areas. So that's an observation about the consultation. I'm not quite sure how we take that forward into your review of the comments that are received, and I just wondered if you'd like to have a word on that.
Well, Chairman, I mean, we're happy to receive comments. Obviously, I mean, this is a public consultation, but you know, the lead member steering group has been involved, and in fact, I think the lead member steering group meets next week again, when one of the first tasks will be to report, at least initially, on the outcome of the consultation. So, you know, but again, it's for members to input to this process as we move forward towards the next version of this plan and any allocations that are in it.
Well, perhaps our two members on that consultation, on that steering group, would take forward the view of this committee. I think you probably agree with a lot of what has been said this evening, and thank you very much for giving up your time to come along and listen to and participate in the discussion. You wish to say something?
Just come back on the point that was mentioned. Thank you again, Chairman. Again, this relates to what we've talked about before, in that, yes, we should enable, where possible, putting housing close to where the industry is. But if you think of the Somerford estate, that was built to provide homes for workers on the factories and the aircraft industry on the other side of the road, so people could do that. But times change. So it would be very interesting to know how many people in Somerford, which is in my county division, now actually work in the industrial areas across, even on the business parks. There won't be anything like the people who worked there originally, because times are changing. The same way we'll go. We can plan to have housing close to where people work, and of course Ellis Lowry painted lots of pictures about housing being built close to where people worked, and we don't want to recreate that. But again, you have the problem of, if we're trying to get labour with a high level of mobility, and you're going to find that they can move from job to job, who's to say that a highly skilled IT technician who works, say, for Condor this week isn't going to get a job next week for a considerably increased pay, say, either on the airport site or on Bournemouth, where he's going to have to travel. This, I think, is a point that we should be looking, and I could be wrong, but I didn't see it in here, that when we're looking at developing estates, and with this in mind, we should be looking at getting high broadband installation put in, so that Virgin or whoever it is won't have to dig up half of Grange Estate to put their fibre broadband in. If we could plan the developments so that fibre broadband is in there and it's easy to access it, that in itself may reduce your need to travel, because it's there. The other thing, of course, on the need to travel, another development is people, we are always assumed that people would travel to shops. Now the shops are travelling to the people, and we didn't consider that. So instead of 50 people on an estate who are going to Sainsbury's, one van from Sainsbury's is making 50 calls. So that is something else. This is one of the things that we can't, it's the unknown unknowns. We don't know what's going to come around the corner. But as far as we do things like that, we can plan for the fibre broadband. We can't plan for the development of shopping through Amazon. But can we look at that? Certainly the fibre broadband when on a new development.
Chairman, there is a policy within the document to encourage telecommunications networks generally, but we can certainly look at specific provision on the sites as we work up towards allocations. Yes.
Thank you. And I'm bringing this meeting to a close, but I will have the final word to say that that the dual carriageway that was on the other side of the Somerford estate was always the Somerford bypass to alleviate the pressure from Somerford Road for all the people who were working in the aircraft factories down there. Right, the meeting is now closed.